catalog essays. Dr. DeCaroli recently co-curated an exhibition encountering the Buddha, art and practice across Asia at Secular Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution. Before taking any more time, I call upon our speaker. Please, sir, start. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for spending this, I guess, late afternoon with me. I want to thank in particular the Department of History and Dr. Seema Bawa for inviting me to share my research with you. I'm going to be putting up share my screen now and use a PowerPoint. So I hope that's okay. Is there a way that that can be enabled for me?
Sure, just a second.
Thank you. I'll begin by saying that typically when we study the past, we have a tendency to study on or to focus on where things began. We apply our skills to determining things like when things originated or the precise time of their creation. What I want to do today is share with you something that as a person well into middle age, I've been thinking about, which is how structures spent their middle years. History that shapes buildings and sacred spaces does not end at the moment that they're first made. Over their histories, they can be intentionally altered to address new needs or accidentally impacted by long periods of habitation and use. The priorities of a community may change from year to year and can shift dramatically over the course of centuries. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the history of repairs and renovations in the Buddhist cave sites of India. I will be focusing primarily on the caves of Canary, but I will also be making reference to other sites in the Western Deccan. Specifically, I would like to address two topics. The first has to do with how the residents of the cave managed water, addressing both the need for it and the damage that it can cause over time. The second topic is to ask how the early caves were renovated to accommodate new images, particularly images of the Buddha. But first, let's talk generally about Buddhist monasteries and rock-cut architecture. For the early Buddhist communities in South Asia, there were several challenges associated with choosing a location at which to build a monastery. As an ascetic institution, remote locations suitable for meditation and away from the noise of the city were both traditional and preferable. Yet this setting could not be overly far into the wilderness either, because the residents of the monastery were still dependent on the alms offered by the urban lay population. Without this dependable source of food and clothes, the monastic institutions would not have been able to function. Other concerns also had to be considered. For example, the monastic codes, or Vinaya, of one of the Buddhist monastic orders stipulates that a monastery must be far enough away from any city to be quiet and restful, but sufficiently close so that an alarm sounded by the monks would be heard and draw a response. There seems to have been, therefore, a rather narrow sweet spot that provided both the appropriate levels of proximity and distance so as to meet both the spiritual and practical needs of the monastic community. Finding a suitable location must have been challenging enough for freestanding monasteries like Sanchi or Nalanda, but the complications would have been magnified exponentially for those seeking to excavate rock-cut dwellings, because mountains aren't always located in the correct distance from cities. These cave-like structures were sculpted entirely by human effort and are believed to have originally been inspired by the rocky outcroppings and hollows used as shelters by wandering ascetics, including the early Buddhists. These rock-cut monasteries can be found across most parts of India, but were primarily built between the 2nd century BCE and the 4th century CE. Some of the best preserved and most spectacular examples are located in the Western Ghats, running along the western coast and inland along the various river valleys that carve up the Deccan Plateau. They range in size from the very modest, as at Kanvita, and all the way to the grandiose, such as at Ajanta, and occasionally seem to have broken the rules about placement. This is to say that only some of them are associated with nearby urban centers. The rest, we assume, were supported by their proximity to well-traveled trade routes. The history of use and habitation at these sites is not always clear. In some cases, as for example at Ajanta, The lack of wear on the door hinges or soot from lamps suggests that most of the monasteries were used for only a short time. At other sites, such as Canary, by contrast, they were occupied for centuries. Over time, it is only natural that repairs and renovations were needed. The rock-cut architecture provides us a unique opportunity, however, to study those changes. This is because the structures are carved into the rock, and therefore any additions and changes leave traces in the stone. Anything new must be carved deeper into the stone than the older portions. In other words, the stone is never added, only taken away. With all this in mind, the first issue I'd like to talk about today is how the makers of these caves handled water. Despite the challenges faced by communities living in these mountainous places, there were also some distinct advantages. One of the most obvious features of these caves is their spectacular views. Although the aesthetic beauty of these vistas is immediately clear, it might not be readily apparent what the practical benefits would be. From the perspective of patronage, however, the benefits of remote caves and grand views were twofold. First, according to the Buddhist teachings, any donations to the Buddhist order continued to bear karmic results as long as they continued to be used. Therefore, construction in the stone of the mountains provided an unparalleled permanency and assured a nearly perpetual karmic reward over many lifetimes. Second, the scenic locations made popular destinations for visitors. Recent studies of Buddhist monastic codes have revealed that maintaining a park-like, beautifully decorated space was important for ensuring the arrival of urban visitors who visited these sites as acts of leisure and often made donations while doing so. Obviously, this benefit applies less to those remote sites on trade routes, but seems to have been a valid concern for locations near urban centers, especially considering that they were often competing with other religious institutions for support. To put it simply, both the inherent permanency and the beauty of these dramatic locations fostered public interest and support. Water, however, could be an issue. The monsoons provided an all or nothing availability of water. Despite being located near rivers, not every river flowed the entire year. Take, for example, the site of Ajanta, whose cut structures fill the cliff face above a dramatic bend in the Wagara River. The appearance of these caves changes dramatically with the coming of the rains. Adding to the seasonal contrast is the dramatic 7-step waterfall that is located directly adjacent to the caves and flows in great torrents during the rainy months. Ajanta is not alone in this regard. The well-known monasteries at Ellora, Baja, Karla, Kondane, and Canary were all located so as to easily access seasonal waters that can cascade down these mountainsides. Certainly, the presence of waterfalls is not unexpected, given that it was erosion that caught from water that created many of these cliffs in the first place. But a number of the sites were built directly adjacent to waterfalls and indicates that there was some intention on the part of the builders. While it was necessary to develop the monastic sites near water supplies, the decision to build near waterfalls suggests that natural beauty was a concern for those choosing to build. Although being proximate to cascading water sources might be dramatic, it is only useful for quenching the thirst of monks when the rain is falling and the seasonal rivers flow. For this reason, all of these monasteries also relied on elaborately engineered systems of gutters and cisterns that ensured a year-round supply of water. Those who donated to the monastic institutions often left behind inscriptions, providing their identities and the nature of their gift. As for example, at Baja, where one of the cisterns was donated by the son of a general, or at Canary Cave 2, where the cistern was dedicated by a goldsmith, and in Canary Cave 7, in which it was a gift of a treasurer. Notably, the tank between Canary Caves 5 and 6 was donated by a minister, serving directly under the courts of the Satavahana kings. So even though we could logically deduce that the donations of cisterns would have been a common and exceptionally necessary gift, these dedications by such remarkably wealthy and prestigious donors also inform us that these gifts carried notable prestige and could be expensive undertakings. After all, they were providing the water to the monks to all the monks who would ever reside at the site. And it was believed that the good karma that would keep accruing as long as the water continued to support the monks, even after the original donor had died. Cost is undoubtedly one of the reasons that not all cisterns are equal in size or shape. Some are quite modest in scale, whereas others are massive subterranean spaces. It's difficult to generalize about what is typical for these cisterns, however, because most of them have never been measured. There are several reasons for this. One is that the openings were kept small to prevent evaporation, and another is that measuring these cavities today would require both climbing shoes and diving gear. And to date, only a few of these have drawn the measuring sticks of intrepid scholars willing to immerse themselves in the murky waters. Although these subterranean spaces may lack the accessibility and adornments of the monastic dwellings or the ritual spaces, we must keep in mind that they were nonetheless major architectural undertakings and vital components to life on the mountainside. To make this point, let's turn to our main focus for today, the Buddhist cave site of Canary. This site, composed of over 100 individual caves, is located in the hills above Mumbai and was built over a long span of time, reaching from the 1st century BCE to the 10th century CE, with the bulk of the construction between the 2nd and 3rd century. The community drew its support from the urban population on the coast, and its beautiful setting, commanding views, and carefully engineered ornamental waterways still draw visitors today, much as they must have in ancient times. If one visits in the rainy season, it becomes apparent that the flow of the water through the site is carefully orchestrated and is a well-loved feature. The path of the flow was thoughtfully regulated, at times gentle and at times pouring in great cascades. Channels and gutters collect the water flowing from above the caves and they direct them either away from the monastery into cisterns located near the entrances of most caves, and those that lead away from the caves serve as sewage and drainage channels. So what we're seeing here is a typical cistern from the entrance of a cave site. There's a gutter that runs up the mountain that collects the water. It would then immediately make a turn and pour down into the cistern, which is located right next to the entrance of a cave. Here you can see one in the rainy season. Erosion has broken part of the stone, but originally the water would have flown down and then directly in this diagonal towards the cistern below. In case this supply would not be enough to satisfy the needs of the large resident monastic communities at the site, additional measures were also taken. In the valley below the caves and a little upriver, one can find the remains of an early dam that had been used to arrest the flow of the river so as to create a small lake at the base of the hill. These measures collectively supported life in the mountainside and made the most of the available resources. In fact, Abhishek Amar has recently written about this dam, suggesting that it was tied to a mid-2nd century agricultural expansion associated with the monastic institution. Nevertheless, these cisterns, dams, gutters, and ornamental waterways that directed and stored water were only half of the engineering problem that the ancient builders faced. The other half involved managing erosion and the invasive water damage that could, over time, destroy the caves and create dangerous mountain slides. Consider again the placement of the gutters at Canary. These channels protect the entryway to the caves and channel the water away from the entrance, which, assuredly makes it more pleasant for those entering and exiting the cave so they don't get water dumped on them. But it also prevents erosion of the thin stone and sculptural decorations placed on the cave's exterior. And, to appreciate how damaging water can be, let's consider the exteriors of both the Baja caves and Pitalkhora. Both sites were badly damaged when their respective cliff faces collapsed and took the exterior portions of the monastic dwellings with them. Just to make my point clear, I think if you look up at the top of the image, you can see where some of the original decoration was. And all of that exterior portion of the caves at Pitalkhora is now missing, leaving only the lower portions and the interior of the caves. Even the interiors of the caves were at risk of water seepage as it found its way into the caves. For example, consider Junar's Amba Ambika Chaicha, which was abandoned before its completion. The builders made the correct choice in abandoning the site because water damage had weakened the stone of the interior by eroding a vein of softer stone running diagonally through the walls. Similar problems afflicted Junar Caves 18 and 19 of the Lenadri group, and any fissures or breaks in the stone were quickly exacerbated by the action of the water, and if left unaddressed, could become a serious problem. In Canary Cave 66, we see a similar situation with erosion following a diagonal split in the stone. But in this case, interior channels were added in an effort to redirect the water. And this may have worked for a time, but ultimately, in this case, it seems to have been ineffective. The repairs at Cave 75 and Canary were more extensive, and the efforts put into the construction of these interior gutters were somewhat more effective in protecting the integrity of the stone. Let me walk you through it. This is the exterior of the cave. If we go to the interior, you can see where the water damage was taking place, cutting a diagonal channel into the wall. In order to stop this from happening, the architects carved this indentation into the wall. And I think you can see that even today it draws moisture during the rainy season. And it redirects the water through a thicker portion of wall down to the ground and in a gutter that leads out of the cave. So these channels were added later in the history of the caves in order to protect the existing stonework. In fact, if I go back to the interior, I think in the lower left, you can see the gutter where the water exits the cave. Perhaps the most successful attempt to circumvent water damage, however, can be seen at Bedza. In order to protect the main stupa hall from damage, a new cell was cut into the side of the main chamber. This room number 2, indicated by the red arrow, puzzled scholars for a long time due to its unusual location. And it was thought maybe this was an unusually placed monastic cell. But it was eventually realized that the function of the chamber was actually to provide the water a place to drain before it could reach the main hall. Given the well-preserved nature of the hall, this seems to have worked very well, and the ingenious intervention fulfilled its task exceptionally well. And again, if you go there during the rainy season, you can see that the water does seep into that cell, and it drains out into a chamber in the porch. So you can see there's a channel cut between the two, and it drains out harmlessly onto the porch rather than damaging the interior. And this is the porch. Okay. In short, architects and donors in these caves grappled with the regulation of water and had a plan both for times of scarcity and overabundance. As we've seen, they developed a number of complex techniques and solutions for addressing these needs. Yet for the ancient builders and residents of these mountainous dwellings, engineering feats were only part of the solution. Equally important and typically much more visible to the casual visitor were their efforts to find religious solutions to these concerns. Before proceeding, it's worth noting that the distinction between religious and non-religious solutions is a division of our own making. The early Buddhists made no distinction between what they saw as the practical and effective nature of a wide range of approaches towards managing water. For this reason, the regulation of water was seen to be a concern not just for architects and craftspeople, but also for monks and ritual experts. That this is the case is immediately apparent to anyone looking at the decoration of early Buddhist monasteries, which prominently feature deities associated with water and rainfall. Among the most frequently encountered on these structures are nagas. These serpent-like deities have several associations, but they seem to have been particularly linked to water in all of its forms. Typically, these deities were associated with a particular lake or river or stream or pond, and could therefore provide for fertility or drought, depending on their whim. In artwork, they are depicted as either shapely humans with an array of cobra hoods emerging from behind their heads, or as multi-headed serpents. At Canary, we can see that the image of the Naga was placed directly above the water cistern. This association is more than just a coincidence. As archaeologist Julia Shaw has noted, the common placement of Nagas along irrigation channels and waterways across large parts of South Asia. This link between Nagas and waterways is supported in the writings of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who visited India in the 7th century. His reports note that it was commonly believed that the renowned monastery at Nalanda was named for a Naga who resided at a nearby water tank. Likewise, when visiting Bodh Gaya, the place of the Buddha's enlightenment, Xuanzang identifies a small temple near the monastery's reservoir, which was sacred to the Naga Muchalinda. This Naga, Muchalinda, famously protected the Buddha from rain and high water by lifting him on his coils and sheltering him with his hood. He did this selflessly so that the Buddha's meditations would not be disturbed by the inclement weather. This situation, in which a Naga supports and protects the Buddha, became a very early artistic motif and appears frequently at early sites like Amaravati. Indeed, even at Kanhari, we find similar pairings of the Buddha and the Naga on the exterior pillar. My favorite example of this association between Nagas and water management can be found at the site of Pitalkhora. Although the entire outer portion of the rock-cut monastery collapsed centuries ago, a portion of the outer gateway still remains. The doorway itself is flanked by powerful guardian figures who stand next to a row of elephants. So the doorway is all the way on the left, the elephants are to the right. And off to the side of the relief is a sculpture depicting a Naga in the form of a multi-hooded cobra. Examining the somewhat eroded Naga sculpture closely reveals that it is placed directly in front of a gutter that collected water from further up the mountain. And in the rainy season, water would have run through this narrow channel and out holes carved into the Naga's multiple mouths. In this way, the water would have flowed or sprayed from the Naga's mouth and into the path of visitors to the site. The Naga's association with abundance and purifying nature of the water must have made this an especially auspicious and noteworthy entryway. Yet Pitalkhora is certainly not the only monastery to have Nagas gracing its entrances. Vrahadeva, the donor to build Cave 16 at Ajanta, left a lengthy inscription in which he refers to the canyon wall as having originally been the abode of the Naga king. But he goes on to inform us that he personally sponsored the construction of a dwelling for this same Naga at Ajanta, presumably because either the monastery had infringed on his old residence or as an act of personal devotion to the Naga king himself. The new dwelling referred to in the inscription is almost certainly the large Naga shrine located below Cave 16 on the path leading up from the river, thereby making the Naga a special inhabitant of the rock-cut monastery. The presence of these figures at Ajanta and similar sites highlights the association between Nagas and the early Buddhist monastic community and provides some indication that these deities were believed to be literal residents of the monastery along with the human occupants. Furthermore, it was believed that the proximity and access to Nagas allowed the monks some ability to regulate the coming of rains and to ward off drought. Support for this claim and insights into this process is provided by a number of literary sources. One example can be seen in the textual records left by the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang. He relates the story of a lake-dwelling Naga who reforms his malicious ways after being converted to Buddhism. But he fears that he will forget his promise to behave properly. He states, "The nature of Nagas is fierce and wicked, so that they are unable to control themselves. If by chance an angry heart arises in me, it will be from forgetfulness of our present agreement." So in order to prevent this, he instructs the human king to leave a drum at the lakeside monastery. The monks in residence were enjoined to beat the drum whenever they saw dark clouds forming, and the sound would serve as a reminder to the Naga of his promise and his agreement to behave properly. Xuanzang therefore describes for us the Naga-centered ritual practice intended to be undertaken by monks in times of extreme weather. There are several other stories that tell of the conversion. Oh, sorry, this is another view of the Naga at 16. Conversion of unstable or dangerous Nagas to the Buddhist teachings, which inevitably calms aspects of their unpredictable nature and makes them answerable to the Buddhist systems of ethics. Although the events may be fantastic, this type of story reinforces the role of monks as intermediaries between the public and the spirits of nature. Such legends have at times been dismissed as simply constituting the ideological sublimation of earlier faiths. And while this may be partially true, I think it is a mistake to see that interpretation as encompassing every aspect of these stories' significance. The simple fact that Buddhist monks and nuns included, believed steadfastly in the existence and power of these spirits. Such beings were an integral part of their world. I already mentioned the drumming ritual recorded by Xuanzang, but we have also evidence of other offerings and prayers to Nagas that were designed to ensure their continued adherence to the Buddhist teachings. A related circumstance was recorded in the 4th century by another Chinese pilgrim, this one Fa Shan. He describes a monastery that is protected by a benign Naga who ensures good rains and harvests. In gratitude for his service, the Naga was built a house in the monastery and was given daily blessings by the monks, some of whom were required to feed him and eat in his residence. In this example, the Naga is maintained, housed, and fed in the monastery in exchange for continued good weather. There's no doubt that the Naga is in the service of the monastery, but it's also clear that the monks have some obligations to him as well, which ensured his continued compliance. Seen in this light, the Nagas are not simply an outdated holdover from earlier times, but are an active and ongoing means for Buddhist community to ensure the proper flow of water for themselves and the wider community. Additionally, Ronald Davidson has recently translated 5th century Indian rituals in which Buddhist monks perform rites to Nagas in an effort to bring the rains. This monastic role as intermediaries between the public and the forces of nature provided the monks and nuns a social role that helped to ensure their relevance and continued support. Focusing solely on images and altars while ignoring the gutters, tanks, and cisterns ultimately blinds us to the seamless connection between these vital and interconnected aspects of monastic life. Nevertheless, images can tell us a lot too, particularly images of the Buddha. This brings us to our second example of cave maintenance and renovation, in which caves had to make room for the Buddha. Let me explain. It is well known that for roughly the first 500 years of Buddhism, the Buddha's image was intentionally and studiously avoided. Although there exists Buddhist art dating from as early as the 2nd century BCE, and prior to the beginning of the 1st century, these scenes contain no actual representations of the Buddha himself. Even though the rest of the scene might be depicted in full, the figure of the Buddha is simply indicated by an absence or an appropriate symbol, such as a footprint or a parasol over an empty throne. In a well-known example taken from the North Gate of the Great Stupa at Sanchi, there is a scene depicting Shakyamuni's great departure. Even though all of the other players in the narrative are represented, Shakyamuni is never depicted in the scene. His presence is indicated primarily by the riderless horse. This custom changed in the years surrounding the start of the Common Era in regions controlled by the Shaka and Kushana kings, followed shortly thereafter by the Satavahana rulers. Although the use of images began slowly, it eventually became widespread in Buddhist sites across South Asia and beyond. Now, although it's not entirely without controversy, the emergence of the Buddhist image cult is fairly well studied in the Kushan Empire. Its development in other parts of Asia has received far less attention, however, and is in many ways less well understood. Looking at the Buddhist sites in the Western Deccan, for example, it can be a challenge to identify the earliest images and the circumstances under which they were accepted as part of regional Buddhist practice. It's important to keep in mind that many of these caves were built before the use of Buddha images were common. So these sculptures had to be added later to the caves. There's ample evidence that the image cult flourished in the caves across the West by the 5th century. Prominent Buddha images, and in some cases entire shrines were added by enthusiastic donors. These so-called intrusive images were added to pre-existing sites whose original plans did not include any images of the Buddha. This pattern of patronage is traceable across the Western Ghats and even further inland to sites like Ajanta. We can, however, assert with equal certainty that the earliest caves in this region, dating to the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, had very limited sculptural decoration and were totally devoid of Buddha images. So with these points as our chronological brackets, we need to explore this period between the 1st and 5th century, for evidence of the first tentative steps towards image use. Notice how these images are deeper into the walls, right? That they're carved into the surface, the original surface of the wall. This indicates that they were added after the caves were built by private donors hoping to gain merit by adding these devotional images to the monastery. In other words, they're called intrusive because they were added after the original construction of the cave and it had to be built deeper into the rock in order to be included. The Satavahana kings who held most of this region from the late 1st century BCE to the 3rd century, with occasional losses to the Kshatrapas in the north, much like the Kushan, it appears that the Satavahana were only rarely direct patrons of Buddhist sites, but they provided the political, cultural, and religious context in which these innovative developments occurred. With this historical context in mind, what does one look for when trying to identify the earliest figural images in the Western caves? One location which may provide us some insight to these processes is the well-known Chaitya Hall at Canary Cave 3. I'm not the first to suggest that this cave above the hills of Mumbai may hold a special place in the emergent figural tradition. Marilyn Leese, Debalamitra, Vijay Deheja, Susan Huntington, and M.K. Dvalekar have all pointed to it as displaying one of the earliest examples of sculptural Buddhas in the region. These authors invariably single out 2 small images for discussion. These images are both located on an exterior pillar attached, located to the right of the courtyard and bear a striking resemblance to early Mathuran style images. So here they are, one from the upper portion of the pillar and one from the lower portion of the pillar. Here's some details. I'm making comparisons here to a Mathuran example, just so you can see some of the stylistic similarities. One of the images stands with a rigid frontal gaze, and the second image is seated here. Both of them draw from Mathuran prototypes. The Canary images both exhibit the Abhaya Mudra. Their plump faces, clinging robes, and broad shoulders make compelling stylistic arguments for assigning them an early date. It is also important to note that both images appear as part of a triad and are flanked by attendant figures carrying offerings. This is curious in that both of these early images appear on an exterior pillar, perhaps indicating that this was a somewhat experimental foray into the new subject matter. Adding to this unusual nature of the site is the presence of another damaged triad on the interior located inside the hall. For reasons that remain unclear, these interior images were placed on the 5th column on the left side of the cave's apsidal hall. Perhaps because of their odd placement and their damaged state, this triad is often overlooked in discussions of images at the site. Although the attendant figures are fairly well preserved, the central image was badly defaced at some point in the cave's history. Nevertheless, the placement of these figures on separate facets of the octagonal column, the attendant's full-bodied appearance and upraised arms closely resembles what we find on the exterior, and make it quite likely that the now missing central figure was originally also a depiction of the Buddha Shakyamuni. The 2 extant Shakyamuni images and the possible defaced third one at Canary all date to about the first phase of construction of the site and must predate or be coincident with the early years of King Gautam, presumably Yajna Sri Satakarni, which points to a date of before 200 BCE. I say that they date to the first phase in part because they are raised from the surface of the stone. So they weren't added after the column was built. They were carved when the column was first added to the cave. Okay. Therefore, a date between 140 and 170 CE for the creation of the Canary images seems likely. And this is perfectly in keeping with comparable examples produced in Mathura and Amaravati during roughly the same periods, Mathura being slightly earlier and Amaravati being slightly later. The early style, small scale, and unusual placement of these images all support the idea that they are among the first to be displayed publicly in the region, but the images at this site may have been more extensive than is typically acknowledged. Now, I previously stated that in rock cut architecture, you can't add more stone, but that was actually not entirely accurate. It's more precise to say that you can't add more stone without leaving a trace. In this case, I'm referring to the sockets used to fix new stonework or affix repairs when portions of the original sculptures break. Although the pillar on the right side portion of the exterior courtway has received a great deal of scholarly attention due to the presence of Buddha images, the left-hand column is quite often ignored in academic studies of the cave. But it too is well worth careful consideration. I've not seen mentioned elsewhere the presence of two slender sockets and traces of a third, which were added to the upper portions of the column's base. These sockets, which I've here outlined in red to make them more visible, are located just above the Naga image and occupy three separate facets of the octagonal shaft. In this arrangement, they exactly mirror the placement of the standing Buddha and his attendants in the right-hand pillar. Now, these sockets are really quite shallow, and the well-preserved left-hand example is about 13 centimeters long, has a width of about 5.5 centimeters, and extends 7 centimeters deep. The central socket is 18 centimeters long, and has both a width and a depth of 7 centimeters. The stone on the socket closest to the cave entrance is broken, but the length of the cut appears to have been approximately 14 centimeters. Given the slender nature of these sockets, it's hard to imagine them serving a structural function. Indeed, it's hard to imagine them being used for any purpose other than for the addition of sculptural ornaments. The placement of these sockets parallels the placements of the sculptural decoration on their partnered pillar on the other side, which face it across the courtyard. This implies an attempt to bring the earlier left-hand pillar in line with the new decoration that was added to the right. What I'm suggesting is that there was an attempt to add a Buddha image and two flanking images so that the pillar on the left mirrored the pillar on the right. Similar socketing is used elsewhere at Canary and can be confirmed by simply looking, so here's the two in comparison, and can simply be confirmed by looking further up the pillar. Now, if one climbs to the top of the hill and looks down at the uppermost portions of the columns, the large sockets used to cut into the capitals of both columns are immediately apparent. Such mortises may have served a variety of functions. Now, it's possible that these holes may have been used to support wooden superstructure, one that perhaps parallels what we find at Bedsa. It is also possible that these attached columns were originally capped by sculptural ornaments of the sort seen at Karla or on the famous Ashokan pillars that were their precedents and inspiration. The presence of a loose sculpture depicting a lion found near Cave 3 has led some scholars to favor this second possibility, suggesting that the sculpture was originally on top of the column. If we look elsewhere at Canary, several other locations can be found which display similar features and that may have allowed sculptures to be added retroactively to the site. Notable among these are the niches placed on the altars next to a stupa in Cave 36, and mortises carved into the benches of Cave 34. Such sockets have no apparent architectural function and thereby raise the likelihood that they supported the inclusion of artwork. Later examples of this process, probably 5th century, are exemplified by niches at two of the chambers of Caves 50 and 53. These niches could potentially have been used for a number of purposes, but the unique profile and indentation carved into the back of Cave 101 leaves very little doubt that this was intended for a seated image. Additionally, Cave 26 has a bench running along the back wall that has two square sockets, one in the center and one to the left. Directly above these, a seated Buddha image making the teaching gesture was added at a later point. The placement suggests that the cave had a devotional function, and this image was possibly intended to supplement or replace images that had previously been added to the cave. Dwalekar identifies the cave as early, based on parts of the octagonal pillar on the veranda, but notes that later 3rd and 4th century inscriptions at the site suggest continued engagement from the community. Although it's plentiful, This evidence in support of additional artwork is necessarily and unfortunately circumstantial. As far as I'm aware, the only loose sculpture found at Canary were the previously mentioned lion and a 10th century wooden image of Tara reported by M.G. Dixit. If, however, this interpretation of the niches is accurate, this evidence points to a process by which figural images were gradually added to the locations across the site after the caves had already been completed. And Cave 3 seems to have been at the forefront of that development. In fact, if we return to the interior of the cave and look to the stupa, a further addition is suggested. Specifically, a familiar arrangement of 3 sockets was added at some point and carved into the floor of the chaicha, placed evenly in front of the stupa. If these were made to accommodate images, and it's hard to imagine what other purpose they might have served, this hints at the growing centrality and importance of the image cult in these regional practices. It's interesting to note that at Jannar, specifically Cave 6 of the Lanadri group, we see a similar arrangement. The stupa hall, which based on its style can be identified as being only slightly older than Cave 3 at Canary, also shows evidence of late sculptural elaborations. On the cave floor, just in front of the stupa, is a rectangular niche, which was added. Obviously, the socket need not have been used to accommodate a Buddha image, but it's in light of what we've seen at Canary, it is certainly a possibility. This assumption finds some support based on what we know about later developments in the region, specifically the late 5th century chaichas like at Ajanta, caves 19 and 26, all feature large sculpted Buddha images in front of or superimposed onto the primary stupas. So again, this evidence is suggestive, so not entirely conclusive. So far, I've proposed that Cave 3 at Canary is one of the sites at which the image cult first took hold in the Western Deccan. Most of this evidence is complicated by the difficulty in pinning down the exact dates of when the additions or defacements occurred. Additionally, some of our conclusions rely on circumstantial evidence, thereby making the conclusions conclusive claims imprudent. However, even if we limit our evidence to the 2 extant early images from the site, we have strong stylistic argument that these are among the earliest images in the Western Deccan. And we also have a strong case for claiming that from these humble origins, a thriving image cult grew at the site. In discussing the early images at Canary, I've already mentioned their stylistic links to Mathura and their similarities to the earliest examples from Amravati, which is not surprising given that both Canary and Amravati fell under the control of the Satavahana kings. This imperial connection provides a welcome similarity to the examples drawn from the Kushan holdings in Mathura and Gandhara, thereby providing useful comparisons. India's cave sites continued to exist and thrive long after their creation. We have looked at the ways water was regulated and stored and directed by both feats of engineering and by appealing to the influence of divine beings. The repairs and accommodations needed to do this left their traces on the caves. Likewise, changes in Buddhist religious practices, most notably the use of devotional images of the Buddha, changed the needs with the needs of the cave's inhabitants. Renovations were made to make space for the new images and new forms of worship. To conclude, I hope that these examples reveal that there is much to learn about the history of these caves and monasteries beyond their origins and well into their long histories of use. Thank you very much.
Shakir?
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah. So that we can have the question answer session. That would be, if there are questions.
Yes,
Shakir.
Divakar Singh, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm just wondering about 2 things which you pointed out about. One, the Nagas association with Buddhism, which is quite apparent in terms of in terms of many symbolism associated with Nagas. I'm just wondering whether Naga has been appropriated or it has some kind of independent cultic, presence. For example, Ajanta cave, where it has been argued that there was some kind of reciprocal exchange between Nagas and it's taming the Nagas' wilderness, so some kind of ideological appropriation by Buddhism. The second thing is, as far as image cult is concerned, most of these images have been donated by monks, as has been pointed out by Gregory Chopin in his many scholarly articles. Most of them are called Tripitikas, one who are learned monks. Those who followed the. So he says that it was the same group of people who introduced the image cult into monastery. Now, I would like to know about your comment on that.
Sure, thank you. Great questions. I'll address the first one first. So yes, unquestionably, the Nagas had their own cult. They were objects of devotion in their own right. We can see this in Mathura, where we have donations by individuals. There's a fellow who identifies himself as a priest of the Naga. DeCaroli, I think, is the name of the Naga. And so we know that they had their own priesthood. They had their own devotees, worshipers, their own shrines. And so what's happening is that as these new religions are entering the scene, be it Buddhism or Jainism, Ajivakas, they're in a sense associating themselves with pre-existent figures. And the Nagas are very important. I think it's no accident that one of the first images of the Buddha is seated under a Naga. One of the first images of the Jain community, Parshvanath, is seated under a Naga. Early images of Balaram, right, with the Naga. There's all of these similar associations, as each of these communities is, in a sense, linking itself to the images of the Nagas. And it's hard to see that as just them suppressing the Nagas. It seems more like a celebrity endorsement, right? It seems more like there's something to be gained by associating yourselves with the Nagas, because they had, I think, very positive associations. And so at Ajanta, it's very clear that the Naga predated the arrival of the monastery, because the inscription tells us that it was the abode of the Naga king, and that the monastery was in a sense intruding on his territory rather than the other way around. And so the Buddhists are very clearly trying to create a new hierarchy in which the Buddha is at the top and the Nagas are below that. But I think it's safe to say that that wasn't the case for every South Asian. I think there were plenty of people at the time for whom the Nagas would have been just as important, or even more important potentially. But over time that shifts, and we start seeing them entering more secondary roles. Now, as for the question about the image tradition, yes, certainly in Mathura, Gregory Chopin has shown that the earliest donations by monks and nuns, like the monk Bala, for instance, were very instrumental in not just creating or donating these first images, but also seem to have shipped them out from Mathura to places like Sarnath and other locations in India. Whether the monks and nuns were alone in donating the Buddha images, that I don't think is the case. I think what it shows is that there was monastic participation in that process. I don't think it rules out the possibility that there were also lay donors who were participating in that tradition. It does seem like for such a major shift in the monastery that there must have been some sort of monastic sanction or approval that was given. I'm not sure a lay person could come in and sort of start telling the monks and nuns what to do. But it does seem like that there were probably, there was a growing interest in images. And it's safe to say that, right around the cusp of the first century, there's this tremendous, tremendous burst in artistic activity in every field, every religion, our first images of kings come about, our first images of the Jain Tirthankaras come about, some of the first depictions of the Vedic deities come about. At the same time, the first images of the Buddha are being made. And so there is this kind of incredible explosion of creative activity that's coming during roughly the time of the Shaka and Kushan kings, when we start seeing images being used in a whole range of new ways. And I think that this shift begins to take place, and it spreads very quickly. I think the Satavahanas were very, very fast in adopting these new modes of representation. They're among the first South Asian rulers to depict themselves on coins, for example. And so I think that indicates that they were, or even like if a site like Nanagat, where potentially you have portraits of the royal family being depicted in a very public way. I mean, that's sort of the first time that happens in any dynasty that wasn't associated with Central Asia, right? I mean, so that's, I think, a major shift in artistic practice. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Moving on, Pravash K. Chaudhary, please. Mr. Chaudhary, go ahead. Pravash?
You're probably muted, Pravash. You'll have to.
Anybody else? Okay, yeah. No, you are not audible.
Nor can we see him. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Is he around? Yeah, there I can see him. Yeah.
Pravash, maybe you can just
now, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
So thank you so much for such a passionate talk and like drawing our attention to so many aspects actually, which we actually overlook or we do not minutely observe and go on interpreting those aspects. So thank you so much for this interesting presentation. But I have some queries, in fact, regarding when we talk about Western Deccan cave sites in general also, and that is true even in the context of pan-Indian Buddhist sites. Like we are coming across not only like the problem of only like the chronology related to placing up of image or the chronology related to how the changes took place within the history of the cave actually. Along with that, we are also witnessing like adding up of new structures, which is like more often like referred to as votive structures. So at these sites, when we talk about particularly the site like Canary, there are scholars who pointed to the fact that we are coming also across a structure which is referred to as votive structures, which were being added at some point of time. We don't know when, but it was added at some point of time in the history of these caves. So I'm interested in knowing your viewpoint on the structures that we are coming across at different Buddhist sites in Western Deccan, which is often referred to as votive structures. Because see, it is also concerning with the problem of conservation, like how the attempts are being made to conserve those smaller structures. So could you please highlight some aspect related to these votive structures which we are coming across at these sites?
I'd be happy to. The the additions that are added later to the sites is being written about now. I think Gregory Schoten's written about it. I think Nicholas Morrissey has been working on these at Ajanta. They seem to be associated with some changes in Buddhist practice. There's references in the inscriptions to groups known as Shakya Bhikshus and a different sort of a more, I guess, Mahayana-centric form of Buddhism that seems to have been caught on at a certain moment in Indian history, maybe around the 5th century. And we start seeing these additions of images, little shrines. That seems to be something that's happening in the cave sites that we see a lot of. In built structures, that is to say at places like Sanchi, Ratnagiri, so on, you see also what are sometimes referred to as Votive Stupas. These are these small stupas. Votive is probably not the right word to use for these, but these seem to be secondary burials associated or monuments associated with members of the community. And I think they're vital to evidence of the continued use and function of the caves, right? I mean, they are our best indication that these sites remain relevant into centuries after they were first constructed, and that they continued to be used even if meanings had changed or the nature of the exact community that was there had shifted religiously. It still is, I think, vital to our understanding. I think one of the great tragedies of early archaeology is the fact that so many of these small stupas were cleared out of Sanchi. When Marshall did his work there, he sort of removed all these things. And I guess in his mind, he was preserving, just as you say, the oldest portions or the most original portions. But I think that's sort of an artificial construction, right? You're sort of choosing one moment and sort of pretending that the rest of the history of the site didn't happen. And in doing that, I think there's a lot to be lost. So sort of coming back to your point on conservation, I share your concern for these small structures. I think they're deeply important, and in part because these are moments in the history of Buddhism in India that are in many ways the least well understood. And I think they provide some of the best evidence that we have for it.
Okay, thank you, Pravash.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. Okay, ma'am.
Any other students who want to ask questions before I? No. Okay. So, Professor DeCaroli, I'm fascinating lecture. I was just, I had, when you were talking, I had a few questions that just popped into my mind as to, how are these, donations assistance and drainage systems, how can we see this kind of a trajectory that goes into the Puranic Purta Dharma, Pushkarni and the wells and all those that are being built along with the temple architecture. So there seems to be this kind of a connection that can be discerned. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that. And one thing that really, because you're talking about the recutting of images into these caves, I was just wondering, at Karle and more at Karle than anywhere else, the Mithunas on the facade, right? So just above that, you have that kind. So you can see an entire chronology there. So how are these connected? How did the people who were doing this later, who were recutting images of the Buddha and and attendant images, connecting these in terms of symbology to the Mithuna images, because some of the monks are also donating the so-called, I think it's called just a Mithuna. I'm denoting such a Mithuna. I think it's at Karle. I remember that thing. So that's one question. And I think I can go on, but I love the thing about celebratory, endorsements, celebrity endorsements, which is what exactly what they probably were of the Nagas. So just two questions before we go on. I hope,
Great. So the first question about the tanks and ponds, what the Buddhists were doing at their cave sites is actually not entirely different at what we see at sites across South Asia. Many religious centers, certainly anyone that's being built in a remote location, will always have a well or other pond, some other water supply, simply because it's necessary. And those were often held to be important locations. The case of Mathura, where we have these some of our best archaeological evidence for early shrines, indicate that there were sacred tanks that were donated by important members of the society. We have at least one inscription of an elite member of the court donating a park and tank. And then we also have another inscription in which two people refer to the image of a Naga and they donate his tank. So there's an association of the water source being associated with either some sort of religious context, but also one that's serving a kind of public good. right, for the good of the community. Julia Shaw in her work has done some very fascinating associations between actual like irrigation for farming and the placement of nagas on water systems. And there's been new work that's been done suggesting that the arrival of Buddhist monasteries they actually brought some of this technology with them, so that when the Buddhists were given land, they would go out to that land and they would also introduce new farming techniques. One of the arguments here, which I think is quite fascinating, is that in order for a monastery to survive, there needs to be surplus. And so if you can have more efficient farming and there's more food produced, it's better for the survival of the monastery as well. And so there's an interesting connection, I think, that's being worked on between the location of monasteries and the development of farming techniques in the area. And I think wells and systems and nagas and all of those things are part of that process. There's an association between early Buddhism and water that I think we kind of don't think about. There are, like, I think I alluded to it, but there's a whole system of 5th century and later rituals that are designed for calling the rain, right? And these are Buddhist rituals for invoking rainfall. Your second question about the mitunas and the placement of the votive images, that one has actually always puzzled me as well. I don't know that I have a great answer. We know that the original, we suspect that the decoration that we see on the Vedikas and the exterior portions of the rock cut structures was appropriated from the kinds of designs that would have appeared either in palaces or on chaityas associated with pre-Buddhist religious centers, so like yakshas and nagas and so on. And then over time, as the Buddha images become added, I've looked just to trying to see if I can figure out why these later images were added, where they were added, and I can't see a pattern to it. It seems to me like wherever there was stone that was available, or something that they felt that was convenient placement or wouldn't disrupt an image too much, they would add the images in. And so I don't know that there's an ideological reason behind it, or an intentionality that suggests a specific meaning. But I would sure love if there was, because it would help make sense out of the placement of these images that comes in so much later.
Also, I was just thinking, when you were talking about song, I assume you were talking about song when you were talking about the Karna. So how do these cults, where Buddha cult and Jainism is also coming up at Kankali Tila at Mathura, and you have from the Indo-Greek layers and also from the Kushana layers, you have these two temples at Sonk of the Naga. So, you have an independent cult, and you also have an appropriation of these cultic images into Buddhism, into Jainism. So this kind of, there must have been some kind of a competitive kind of struggle for patronage also, I would so assume. Since they're all, at least in the early period.
It's interesting. There's, like you mentioned, there is this donation by a man named Devila, who identifies himself as the priest of the Naga, which is Dadikarna, but he's donating at a Buddhist monastery. And so the question is, does this mean that there was a shrine to the Naga in the monastery, or that the priest also considered himself a devotee of the Buddha? It's hard to know how to interpret the connection between the two, but I think it's safe to say that there was, while there was competition, I think there was also a lot of interaction. I think that all of these communities are borrowing from each other. I mean, if you think about the ways in which a Buddha is honored, okay, so you build a structure and you circumambulate, you bring him flowers and offerings and garlands, but that doesn't make sense in a strictly Buddhist context, because the Buddha is not there to receive them. But those are the actions that people associated with ritual behavior, because they've been doing it for centuries in honoring things like yakshas and nagas. And so the Buddhists then scramble to find a justification for why those actions are still appropriate for the Buddha. And so I think what's happening is that the Buddhists are like a sponge pulling in the practices that are around them. And they're not alone in doing that. I think the Jains are doing the same thing. I think we find some of the early, like Krishna worship and so on, the early Vaishnava material. In some cases, it makes more sense or less sense, or they have to, explain it more carefully, depending. A Buddha or a Tirthankara is supposed to be entirely absent. And so you have to make justifications for why giving there makes sense. Whereas if you're worshiping Krishna, it's apparent why that works, right? So there's different issues that are facing different communities, but they're all kind of doing the same thing. I mean, if you look at the inscriptions, all of them are referring to their object of worship as Bhagavat, right?
Exactly.
So it's the same word, no matter who it is. And so I think we have to realize that although we tend to study at least sometimes religions in isolation, that's artificial, and that they were all kind of in the mix together and taking each other's best ideas.
Yeah, and what I call the common cultural matrix, because at Sonk, the temple of Naga also has Shalabhanjikas, similarly. Yes. So they're all, or they would have the Gajalakshmi or whatever. So they're kind of borrowing from each other. But I think we can discuss this later.
Yeah, I would love to. Actually, I'd like to get your insights on it. I think I have.
Yeah, a lot of students want to ask questions. So I'm just withdrawing now. I have many more questions, but I won't take them up.
I'm sorry, I supposed to ask Professor Bawa, but in between there's a disability in my internet connection. So I have just one observation. We have a Buddhist cave in Western India, series one by one. And if we look at the climate of that area, it's a semi-arid. So for that reason, water management is a very practical aspect in that. So we are getting reservoir, we are getting channel to collect the monsoon rain, because that's the maximum rainfall during June to say August and September. But what is the case of Brahmanical caves in central India, say Vidisha, where it's a larger study done by Michael Willis and Julia Shaw together, and they are looking that entire presence of water, not just as for the management of the cave living, like you need water for drinking, bathing, and so many other purposes. So it might be a kind of a representational, a kind of a presence of water. So, I mean, do we find the presence of water, tank, reservoir, channel in this entire Western caves link as a kind of a representation rather than a day-to-day purpose of usage? I mean, that's my question. Like, is there any kind of a difference between the management or representation of water channel, water reservoir, water tank in Western Indian caves and Central Indian caves? Though the basic differences are one lot is Buddhist, the other lot is Brahmanical, mostly Vaishnavite caves. Representation is Vaishnavite. So what is your opinion in that?
That's a great question. I like the idea of the distinction between the practical and presentational, right? The idea that some of it is going to be more for an aesthetic or a ritual function, and some of it's just to survive. And now that I think about it, I see what you're saying. I know that at some of the sites that Sean Willis have talked about, that there is this kind of royal connection, shows of seasonal change, the idea of the cosmic waters and military victories being alluded to, and that sort of thing. And I wonder, when we look at sites like Canary now, and I hadn't really thought about it in this way, where some of the water channels are very shallow, but they're quite beautiful. And I wonder, we talk about the term for the monasteries is arama, which is garden. And I wonder if, one of the reasons why so many of them are near these beautiful waterfalls or have these decorative channels is in part because it was part of the presentation. It was part of something that made it beautiful. I mean, you're not going to be drinking from some of these shallow pools or really fast rushing areas, but for certain times of the year, it must have been rather remarkable. I mean, it still is remarkable. So I hadn't thought about that, but I think maybe that's a good way to think about it. I suspect there probably is an aspect of the decoration that would be similar to what we see. It might not have had the same like Gupta royal significance, because I don't know that we have the same degree of royal patronage in many of the Buddhist sites. But in terms of it being serving a less practical function, I think there's something to that. So thank you for the question, but I'm something I'm probably gonna have to think about more before.
Because what I was thinking, like two images are closely associated in those two cases. One is the Naga image in Enter Western Indian Caves, and when it is coming in Central India, it's Varaha avatar, was also associated with take the earth from below the water and pushing it up and all. So, I mean, maybe it could be that religious affiliations are associated the two places, because that's a very, this question is also never answered by Michael Willis and Julia Shaw, because he is saying it's a ceremonial ground which has a lot of other, a kind of Gupta ritual representation rather than a kind of practical usage of water storing and use it for, dry season and all.
It's also clear that in the Vaishnava imagery, the Naga is often more subjected to, like, so Varaha at Udayagiri, for instance, steps on the Naga, right? So he's sort of he's begging for mercy. Or at the same site, we also have Vishnu reclining on Sesha, right? So Ananta. And so we have this scene of again, Vishnu on top of the Naga. And I think in both of those cases, there's reasons to think that's directly related to control of waters, whether it be the river systems or the coming of the rain seasonally. But there's clearly a kind of royal association or religious association with having the capacity to control and regulate water. And I think that's part of the power of that symbolism, no matter where you are. I think that's true in many parts of the world.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Ashu, will you please go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Sir, I just wanted to know regarding what kind of social cultural role that the Renovate particularly talk about the Canary as one of the eco-strategic magnitude that played an important role in evolving interaction between the urban centers. So I just wanted to know. So, and also, since can we say that it was one of the strategically controlling point for communicating the trade networks and also, and I don't know whether this question makes any sense, but still I was just thinking, like, what if this controlling of water, like the way what we are talking about, so is it possible that it is actually meant to facilitate water facilities for the villages who are actually having this issue? So can we look from that perspective also?
Yeah, absolutely. Abhishek Amar has been working on that, working on archaeology of dams and water systems and relations to local communities. I think there's been others working on the relationship between evidence of irrigation and farming associated with those same water tanks that would have served the monastery. And so I think that's absolutely the case. To your first part of your question, that's a good question. I don't know that we know a lot. I mean, we sort of assume that the monastery at Canary was supported by the people living in the region that's now Mumbai, and that was already a lucrative port and a place of wealth. And so that excess would have been enough to support this large monastery. It's also one of the reasons why Canary has this remarkably long lifespan, right? I mean, compared to so many of the Buddhist cave sites or any cave site, it just continues to be occupied and renovated and revised and built on and talked about in ways that we don't have for other sites. And so I think that speaks to the success of the nearby community. I don't know of any work that's been done specifically linking like individuals or I don't know what we know about life in the port at the time with what's going on at the caves. But it would be an interesting thing to look at. I don't know how we would recover that, but maybe there's names or evidence from the inscriptions and the donation records that would give us some information about that. But it's clear that the two are very closely linked and that they depend. Canary would not be there in the way that it is if it wasn't for the wealth that was coming out of the city below.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Soumya Malik, will you please ask a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an informative lecture. I just wanted to ask one thing that after so much of the preservation and conservation being held there at the sites, don't you think that there might be some improvisations being done as if we talk about a researcher studying about that site, and there might be some biases or some improvisation related to the perception of the context being changed because of that, and that leads to the improvisation of the documentation processes as well, and the documentation policies and the aspects which we might have to take in consideration that might not be as useful as they are now.
If I understand the question correctly, I agree with you. I think there is absolutely the potential for human error and for drawing the wrong conclusions based on what we see now versus what people sort of imagine it should be, or what it.
If I talk about your approach specifically, how do you think you can study the imageries, iconographical changes which happen because of the water seepage or withering or eroding of the imageries?
So one of the biggest challenges with the topic, which I think is perhaps what you're alluding to, is that it's very difficult to tell when those interventions were made. It's very difficult to know when an image was destroyed or when a gutter was added. And so I've been using vague terms like later in the cave's history or at a later point. And the only way that we can be sure of that is because of the way rock cut architecture works, right? If it's deeper, it's later. That's sort of the general rule that you know, when a wall is finished, if an image is raised from the wall and the wall is flat behind it, we know it dates to the original construction of the cave, right? Because it's a relief, so it's raised. If it's carved deeper in, it's later. And so based on that, I can say, oh, okay, these were added later. How later? I don't know. And so one of the more difficult parts is determining the sequence. So for instance, at Cave 3, we have this defaced small image on the interior of the cave. I have no idea when that happened. I would love to know when that happened because that could really change my argument one way or another. But I don't know of any way to determine that. You know, we can use stylistic comparisons to try and say, oh, this image looks this way, but we can't really do that for a crack in the wall or for an indentation. So, you know, when these human interventions took place is, I think, a tricky question because, you know, I think it's potential that something was done, you know, as an act of vandalism in, you know, the 1800s, and we're saying, oh, well, something changed in the first century. I mean, obviously that's a huge problem. So I guess my only advice is that we kind of have to be cautious, and I think we need to be careful what we consider conclusive. I think it's okay to draw a conclusion and say this is possible, this is likely. But I think if one person says it might be this, the next person says it is this, and then before you know it, somebody treats it as a fact. And I think that's the danger that comes about. So I think we need to, you know, all be aware of what we can be confident about and what seems just tentative.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. I think there are no more questions. So thank you very much, sir, for this refreshing talk. And I think it is better to call off the session now.
Before you do that, Shakir, you need to announce next week. Do we have something for next week?
Yeah, next week we have another important lecture on, it is basically about these epidemics. Actually, yeah, it is migration pandemics The Age of Pandemics by Chinmay Tombe from IIM Ahmedabad. Please join us on Wednesday, 29 September, sharp at 3:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So with this announcement, I just want to close this session now. Okay, ma'am.
Thank you, Professor DeCaroli. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. I hope to
In
see you all soon
person.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah, that would be. I look forward to it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.